Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I go through the current status of my Sunday sermon. I'm going to begin with this question this week. Was Jesus a racist? John Sook was a very prominent pastor in the Christian Reformed Church for a number of years. He was the editor of the Banner, which when it comes to the Christian Reformed Church hierarchies is almost as high as it gets in some ways. And he was a missionary in the Philippines. He was a pastor in various congregations. A number of years ago, he wrote a book entitled Not Sure, A Pastor's Journey from Faith to Doubt. And he left the Christian Reformed Church and now pastors in the United Church of Canada congregation in the city of Toronto. I don't know John well at all. We've conversed via social media over the years. I actually used to rent an apartment from him when I was in seminary. I lived beneath he and his wife. And he wrote this book, and he keeps a blog, and he'd often write bits about his sermons or post some of his sermons online. And in 2014, I caught this sermon where he dealt with the parallel passage for what I'm dealing with in Mark in the Gospel of Matthew of the Syrophoenician woman and what Jesus had to say to her. And he called it Jesus' racial slur. And it fits very well with his ideas of how he changed his mind about the Bible. And, racism has become in our culture sort of the cardinal sin. And so, people like to cast Jesus one way or another. And this story bothers people. This story bothers John Sook, and it bothers a great number of people by the way Jesus treated this woman. Now, we've been going through the Gospel of Mark, and we've seen Jesus almost harried by the crowds. There's so many people wanting healings or miracles or help or to listen or something from him that it appears he needs to get away from it all. So from there he went out. He set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now, this also gives us an idea that Jesus' reputation and word of what he had been doing had spread even outside of the Jewish community in Galilee, all the way to the coast, where Tyre and Sidon and the Phoenicians had settled centuries before. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Did Jesus call this woman a dog? Is he putting her off, perhaps indefinitely? Does Jesus not care for the suffering of her daughter or this woman? This story has bothered people for many, many years because Jesus doesn't seem to look good. And if you're doing propaganda, you want to have a little bit of reputational discipline going on here. Now, over the years, there have been many, many attempts to explain this. And you can read commentaries, and you can read what theologians do with this, and you can read one of my favorite commentary series is this Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture. And it gives a lot of what church fathers thought of certain passages, things gleaned from their sermons. Well, here's just a few ideas of the many, many that have been put out over the years. Jesus was a captive to the idea of his times. That's a very contemporary understanding. And, of course, that troubles many Christians because, well, is Jesus not God? And can Jesus not transcend the ideas of his time? Was he limited in the way that we see other people limited? Some people say there's some cultural confusion between the contemporary readers and the original context. And that's quite likely the case, but does that just kind of justify what Jesus has to say to this woman? Others might say the Jews are God's chosen people. Everyone else is second class. Get over it. Perhaps a contemporary way of approaching it might be to reverse the script. Jesus is calling out the oppressive culture of the Tyrian Greeks and denouncing the overclass by reversing the social order. And this woman is therefore, by virtue of her ethnic group, she is an oppressor, and she, in fact, deserves this comeuppance by Jesus, part of the oppressed group. But then again, she is a woman and she's not a man, so shouldn't oppress a woman. And the Romans were really over more than the Greeks, so maybe this reversing the script doesn't really work either. Well, I want to do a little bit more thinking about this passage and along the lines of a lot of the arguments that I've been making lately. So in my sermon on Jesus water walking, I talked about frames, and we noted how that one episode of water walking, depending on the questions we bring to the text, depending on the things that we want from the text, depending on the types of issues we are interested in, what we find is we read this story in different ways. In terms of water walking, there was the scientific frame where, well, Jesus breaks the laws of physics, and that's important. The individual frame, Jesus will come to save me when I'm in trouble. The trainer frame, Jesus brings troubles into the lives to test our faith and make us strong. And so we bring all these frames, and what so often happens in a story like this is that we've got the frame of racism in mind, and so we read the story and, aha, racism, I have found it right here in Jesus. And, well, okay, well, still the situation might trouble, but the first thing we should probably do is own our frame, because if we're coming to this story thinking about racism, we'll probably find it in the story. If we come to this story thinking about dogs, we'll say, oh, look, there's a dog in this story. So the frames are important, and I think we should own our frames and at least take that step before we begin judging people too quickly. Now, those of you who are following my work through Vervaeke's stuff will notice that I continue to integrate some of what I've learned in his course. The world is aspectually, combinatorially explosive. Well, those are some fancy words. In any given moment, there are nearly limitless perspectives through which we apply moral and ethical filters, and this has to do very much with the frames. And if depending on where you're from and what your frames are, there are almost innumerable things to pay attention to at any given moment in life. Now, I want to apply this to Jesus and apply it to the Jesus we know theologically. Because Jesus is, according to the dogma and doctrine of the church, the perfect Son of God. And so, unlike us who have our filters kind of corroded and corrupted and clogged with all sorts of our agendas and our sinful biases and all of this, the perfect Son of God comes to this world, and how much trouble can't he see? It's sort of like when I walk into an apartment building or some new construction, I just look around, and the aspects I bring to the building, does it have a nice view? The things I care about, are there lots of places to put my commentaries? These would be the kinds of things that would appear to me. Those are my frames. But if I walk through new construction with a friend of mine that works construction, they start looking around and say, well, that door wasn't quite hung right, or this room isn't quite square, or this room is very well put together, or the builders who put this together didn't do very well. Now, if you're the perfect Son of God, inhabiting and moving around imperfect people, what couldn't you see? If you were to sit down with Jesus and say, Jesus, tell me everything wrong with me, how long would it take? Really, the more important question is, how much of it could you sit through? How many things could Jesus see in any given moment that he could address as missing the mark? Now, again, a lot of this mark missing in judgment that we bring to a situation comes from our filters. If we're really hot on pointing out racism, well, we look at Jesus here and say, he's a racist, or I haven't even pursued the sexist angle. He's sexist, or I flipped it with my reversing the script one. Jesus is speaking for the oppressed, and he's speaking against this oppressive woman, even though she has a daughter who's now ill. Maybe this woman is getting what she deserves by having a daughter who is ill. Maybe this is karma. You notice that you can bring a lot of frames to these questions and come out with a lot of easy answers and say, see, the Bible teaches, well, whatever the frame is that I bring to it. Now, if Jesus is the perfect Son of God, that's going to have a frame, and that's going to have a really amazing and probably incredibly complicated frame, because everything he sees everywhere he goes, all he sees is mark missing. Would he even leave the house or stop addressing the faults of one person if he started down that road? Now, so those of you who are watching my channel, those of you in church, In church, I'll phrase this a little bit different. If you want to see the church vision, you can go to the church version. You can go to the church channel, and sometimes I remember to put a link in this video of that. One of the things that I've been thinking about is God is the ancient solution to the frame problem, and God is the frame of all frames. And in one sense, being the judge of the universe means God decides in any given aspectual moment of the world, and it's God's frame that matters. That should both, sometimes encourage us and probably sometimes trouble us. But Jesus gets to pick the frame. And, what frame is Jesus using here? Now, even if we add to all of this mark missing, pointing out, judgment that Jesus could be doing, how about the healing aspect? Who could Jesus not heal? I mean, if Jesus is walking by and he says, well, you better get that mole checked out, maybe you should. And, he's got cancer, they've got heart disease. 2 months from now, they're going to have a stroke. Again, think about this. What would it be like to be Jesus if this was part of your consciousness? And of course we don't know. We can only speculate. But could Jesus not heal the cancer unknown to people, or the strokes that people would have weeks or months down the road, or the heart disease that they were developing, or the mental illness that they didn't see anything wrong with them? I know a lot of schizophrenics. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm not going to go to the doctor. But that's pretty common, actually. Jesus is overlooking probably nearly everything he could potentially see if we continue to work out this question, this idea, this perspective. Why was Jesus sent to Israel? Now, this is something that is highlighted in the text. It's highlighted in the Matthew version of the text. It's not really here in the Mark version. But why is Jesus sent to Israel? Well, it's because of context and because of frames. And in fact, the construals of Israel itself are important for the witness and the message and what Jesus is going to do. Israel is God's narrative focal point, standing in for all of humanity. That's how the Bible is written. That's how it's put together. That's how the mission comes together. This is part of the reason Jesus keeps talking about what we today call the Old Testament, and keeps it very much in his focus, because if you want to understand me, you've got to know this book. Jesus is not here just to do good in a general way or random acts of kindness. And I've made the point a number of times that if Jesus wanted to somehow, help more people, he could have founded the Red Cross. Well, he wouldn't have called it the cross yet, because that hasn't happened. Or maybe give them, some formula for antibiotics and say, if someone's sick, give them that. But how are they going to know if it's viral or bacterial? Or you very quickly begin to see that context and culture and frame have everything to do with everything. And Jesus is not just random. And so, in other words, if we want to understand Jesus, that's why we read the Old Testament, that's why we read the New Testament, that's why we study history, that's why we examine the grammar, that's why we do all of this work, including the symbolism and the culture and all of this. And Jesus didn't just plop out of heaven doing random acts of goodness, which is, for most of us, being fairly unconscious of frames and context, what we would think about, failing to see everything that we are bringing to the question. Personhood. Personhood is the conscious, willful employment of rationality towards an end. And Jesus is acting in all personhood with intention in a way here. And it's already been established by the text that he's looking to take a break, because what God in his incarnation has taken on is our weakness, as the book of Hebrews says. And Jesus' miracles won't convey their full meaning in other cultural settings. We can see this if you look to the book of Acts, at Acts 14, where Paul and Barnabas do miracles in a non-Jewish community, and they say, there's Zeus and Hermes. It's like, context matters. So what is Jesus going to do? Well, Jesus already said, hey, I got this little parable about dogs. I don't know if you're going to like it. How she would hear it in her cultural filters, I can't say. But this is how she answers him. But she answered him, Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. She enters into his parable. Then he said to her, For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. So she went home, found the child lying in bed, and the demon was gone. Wow. You can see Jesus gets it both ways. On one hand, we condemn him because, he's racist. On the other hand, Jesus explains that this is my mission. This is the rule. I'm going to keep it. And she finds an exception. She finds a loophole. And the Gospels are full of this, and it's so delightful. The woman blazes a trail with a few others, like the demoniac on the other side of the sea, or the woman at the well. She becomes, possibly in a sense, an apostle to her own people about what God has done. She obviously has some insights into faith that must have been given her by the Holy Spirit. She did not take the road of ascent. She did not say, I'm a Tyrian Greek. You should do this for me, you lousy Galilean. Where are you from? Nazareth or someplace? No. She knew all she had was need, and she placed herself more on Jesus, accounting for more on Jesus' goodness than any construct of her deservedness. She, in fact, folds herself into the story and takes on what really is Christ-likeness, making herself nothing before him and just basically saying, all I have is need. All my daughter has is need. Can't you please fit me into your story? And he does. So Jesus is not just seen as the hope and messenger to Israel, but Jesus is seen as the King of the world. Now we must all have our frames. We can't help but have them, and they will always be with us. Our frames often get in the way, and they blind us. We can't see Jesus because we've got our certain frames and our biases and our prejudices, and these cause problems between us all the time. Chaos abounds, and we often find ourselves in a place like this woman, seemingly outside the scope of blessedness. Yet suddenly an opportunity presents itself, but how to approach it? One of the delightful things about this story is God understands rules and exceptions, which is a crazy thing, because, there needs to be rules, but there often should be exceptions, and it seems God knows this. And Jesus knows this. Rules are important. Jesus had a mission, and there were rules around it, and he would be faithful and abide by those rules. But exceptions are important too, and this gives this woman an opportunity and a chance, and that's part of why the story brings so much good news and so much glory, because you might feel yourself far from God, and you might say, well, I'm not in the church. I'm not in the community. God has no reason to listen to me. My life is a mess. I've done all kinds of wrong things. But if you throw yourself at his mercy and recognize that all you have is need, maybe he'll make an exception. Why not try? So what does this woman bank on? Is she finding status in victim culture? Is she looking to find leverage over God? She banks on God's generosity, even in tension with God's rules, rather than her own ability to put God in her debt and force God to give her what she wants. And Jesus delights in her initiative. So what are you banking on? Well, God has rules. God should have rules, in fact. We say, well, God has all these laws of physics that he should keep, and that's why we call them laws, because we assume that there's a lawgiver. This language continues, and we don't think anything of it. So what are you banking on? Can you imagine that God is more generous and open than you might expect? If you get the opportunity, or if you have need, can you imagine maybe you should bring it to him? I would recommend it.